Blake. 1. If one follow Blake's mind through the several stages of his poetic development, it is impossible to regard him as a naïve, a wild man, a wild pet for the supercultivated. The strangeness is evaporated. The peculiarity is seen to be the peculiarity of all great poetry, something which is found, not everywhere, in Homer and Aeschylus, and Dante and Villon, and profound and concealed in the work of Shakespeare, and also in another form in Montaigne and in Spinoza. It is merely a peculiar honesty, which, in a world too frightened to be honest, is peculiarly terrifying. It is an honesty against which the whole world conspires, because it is unpleasant. Blake's poetry has the unpleasantness of great poetry. Nothing that can be called morbid or abnormal or perverse, none of the things which exemplify the sickness of an epoch or a fashion have this quality. Only those things which, by some extraordinary labor of simplification, exhibit the essential sickness or strength of the human soul. And this honesty never exists without great technical accomplishment. The question about Blake the man is the question of the circumstances that concurred to permit this honesty in his work, and what circumstances define its limitations. The favoring conditions probably include these two: that, being early apprenticed to a manual occupation, he was not compelled to acquire any other education in literature than he wanted, or to acquire it for any other reason than that he wanted it, and that, being a humble engraver, he had no journalistic social career open to him. There was, that is to say, nothing to distract him from his interests or to corrupt these interests, neither the ambitions of parents or wife, nor the standards of society, nor the temptations of success, nor was he exposed to imitation of himself or of anyone else. These circumstances, not his supposed inspired and untaught spontaneity, are what make him innocent. His early poems show what the poems of a boy of genius ought to show: immense power of assimilation. Such early poems are not, as usually supposed, crude attempts to do something beyond the boy's capacity. They are, in the case of a boy of real promise, more likely to be quite mature and successful attempts to do something small. So with Blake, his early poems are technically admirable, and their originality is in an occasional rhythm. The verse of Edward III deserves study, but his affection for certain Elizabethans is not so surprising as his affinity with the very best work of his own century. He is very like Collins. He is very 18th century. The poem Weather on Ida's Shady Brow is 18th century work. The movement, the weight of it, the syntax, the choice of words. The languid strings do scarcely move, the sound is forced, the notes are few. This is contemporary with Gray and Collins. It is the poetry of a language which has undergone the discipline of prose. Blake, up to 20, is decidedly a traditional. Blake's beginnings as a poet, then, are as normal as the beginnings of Shakespeare. His method of composition in his mature work is exactly like that of other poets. He has an idea, a feeling, an image. He develops it by accretion or expansion, alters his verse often, and hesitates often over the final choice. The idea, of course, simply comes, but upon arrival it is subjected to a prolonged manipulation. In the first phase, Blake is concerned with verbal beauty. In the second, he becomes the apparent naïf, really the mature intelligence. It is only when the ideas become more automatic, come more freely, and are less manipulated, that we begin to suspect their origin, to suspect that they spring from a shallower source. The songs of innocence and of experience, and the poems from the Rossetti manuscript, are the poems of a man with a profound interest in human emotions, and a profound knowledge of them. The emotions are presented in an extremely simplified, abstract form. This form is one illustration of the eternal struggle of art against education, of the literary artist against the continuous deterioration of language. It is important that the artist should be highly educated in his own art, but his education is one that is hindered rather than helped by the ordinary processes of society which constitute education for the ordinary man. For these processes consist largely in the acquisition of impersonal ideas, which obscure what we really are and feel, what we really want, and what really excites our interest. It is, of course, not the actual information acquired, but the conformity which the accumulation of knowledge is apt to impose. That is harmful. Tennyson is a very fair example of a poet almost wholly encrusted with parasitic opinion, almost wholly merged into his environment. Blake, on the other hand, knew what interested him, and he therefore presents only the essential, only, in fact, what can be presented and need not be explained. And because he was not distracted or frightened or occupied in anything but exact statement, he understood. He was naked and saw man naked, and from the center of his own crystal. To him there was no more reason why Swedenborg should be absurd than Locke. He accepted Swedenborg and eventually rejected him for reasons of his own. He approached everything with a mind unclouded by current opinions. There was nothing of the superior person about him. This makes him terrifying. 2. But if there was nothing to distract him from sincerity, there were, on the other hand, the dangers to which the naked man is exposed. His philosophy, like his visions, like his insight, like his technique, was his own, and accordingly he was inclined to attach more importance to it than an artist should. This is what makes him eccentric, and makes him inclined to formlessness. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Is the naked vision. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. Is the naked observation. And the marriage of heaven and hell is naked philosophy, presented. But Blake's occasional marriages of poetry and philosophy are not felicitous. He who would do good to another must do it in minute particulars. General good is the plea of the scoundrel, hypocrite, and flatterer, for art and science cannot exist but in minutely organized particulars. One feels that the form is not well chosen. The borrowed philosophy of Dante and Lucretius is perhaps not so interesting, but it injures their form less. Blake did not have that more Mediterranean gift of form, which knows how to borrow as Dante borrowed his theory of the soul. He must needs create a philosophy as well as a poetry. A similar formlessness attacks his draftsmanship. The fault is most evident, of course, in the longer poems, or rather the poems in which structure is important. You cannot create a very large poem without introducing a more impersonal point of view, or splitting it up into various personalities. But the weakness of the long poems is certainly not that they are too visionary, too remote from the world. It is that Blake did not see enough, became too much occupied with ideas. We have the same respect for Blake's philosophy, and perhaps for that of Samuel Butler, that we have for an ingenious piece of homemade furniture. We admire the man who has put it together out of the odds and ends about the house. England has produced a fair number of these resourceful Robinson Crusoes, but we are not really so remote from the continent, or from our own past, as to be deprived of the advantages of a culture if we wish them. We may speculate for amusement whether it would not have been beneficial to the north of Europe generally, and to Britain in particular, to have had a more continuous religious history. The local divinities of Italy were not wholly exterminated by Christianity, and they were not reduced to the dwarfish state which fell upon our trolls and pixies. The latter, with the major Saxon deities, were perhaps no great loss in themselves, but they left an empty place. and perhaps our mythology was further impoverished by the divorce from Rome. Milton's celestial and infernal regions are large, but insufficiently furnished apartments filled by heavy conversation. And one remarks about the Puritan mythology and historical thinness. And about Blake's supernatural territories, as about the supposed ideas that dwell there, we cannot help commenting on a certain meanness of culture. They illustrate the crankiness, the eccentricity, which frequently affects writers outside of the Latin traditions, and which such a critic as Arnold should certainly have rebuked. And they are not essential to Blake's inspiration. Blake was endowed with a capacity for considerable understanding of human nature, with a remarkable and original sense of language and the music of language, and a gift of hallucinated vision. Had these been controlled by a respect for impersonal reason, for common sense, for the objectivity of science, it would have been better for him. What his genius required, and what it sadly lacked, was a framework of accepted and traditional ideas, which would have prevented him from indulging in a philosophy of his own, and concentrated his attention upon the problems of the poet. Confusion of thought, emotion, and vision is what we find in such a work as Also sprach Zarathustra. It is eminently not a Latin virtue. The concentration resulting from a framework of mythology and theology and philosophy is one of the reasons why Dante is a classic, and Blake only a poet of genius. The fault is perhaps not with Blake himself, but with the environment which failed to provide what such a poet needed. Perhaps the circumstances compelled him to fabricate. Perhaps the poet required the philosopher and mythologist, although the conscious Blake may have been quite unconscious of the motives.